If you remember, when we were looking at arrays, I did the type of on an array and it returned back the word object. So that's actually another data type in JavaScript that we haven't looked at until now. Obviously, given the title of this lesson, we're going to look at objects. So an object is similar to an array in some ways, but its intent is dramatically different. An array will hold a list of information. In other words, there may be many data items, whether they're strings or numbers or booleans or even objects, each stored in a different element of the array. Contrast that to how an object works. An object contains the related properties of a single data element. So array, many data elements. An object, one data element but has attributes. So the settings of the properties define the characteristics of the object. So let's say, for example, that you want to have a car. And so an array will only really let you save maybe the year of the car or the make of the car or the model of the car as a string or maybe some identifying number. But an object would allow us to define all of those properties kind of in the same container. So, if you try to keep track of all the properties and maybe even all the methods that belong to a car, but you keep them as separate variables and separate functions, you'd run the risk of clashing with other variables and functions that have the same name for a different car. Okay, but objects let us keep that information kind of safely locked away in their own little container where the relationship between all those properties and functions are obvious, that they all kind of belong together to describe one car. And then you might have another object that describes a different car. And you can keep both of those objects, those two cars, in an array of cars. So hopefully you can see the relationship between those. All right. So let me first of all start out by creating a new file, object.js. And so, I may have an object that has a series of properties that describe a specific car, and I might want to, for example, keep track of the make, the model, and the year, and so on. And I may have some functions that I need as well, things like getting the price of the car based on some criteria, maybe the year of the car and things of that nature. And I may want to print out a special description of the car that includes many things like the make, the model, the year in a special format. But I might define a car object like so. So let's do let car equals, and then we define an object using a code block, so curly braces. Now I'm going to use kind of a name value pair here, so let me just go ahead and start typing. All right, take a second and catch up with me there if you like. Now let's go ahead and use the print description function like so. And let's use the year property like so. I'm going to save my work and then I'm going to type in node object or object. And the first printout is BMW 745 Li because we're printing out the make and the model of this car. All right. And then here I'm just getting the year of the car and printing that out in a console window. All right. So in this case, this object that I've built on screen we're dealing with a tangible, real world, and very relatable concept. That of a car. We've all driven in cars or have driven cars. In your JavaScript code, you'll occasionally be working with objects that define tangible, real world things like cars. But you're also going to work with things that represent more abstract concepts that are specific to web client or web server development. So in this sample, I created an object using what's called object literal syntax. So I literally want to create this object, and then I'm going to assign that object to a variable named car. And the body of the object is, like I pointed out, defined with a series of curly braces. Here, this set of curly braces at the outermost level here, this defines kind of the boundaries for the object, and everything that lives inside of it is either a property of that object or a function called a method inside of that object. So let's start off in lines 3, 4, and 5. Here we have a list of name value pairs. So here's the name of the property and here's the value of the property. In this case, notice that each of the names of the properties are just identifiers. They're just like variables. In fact, you'll probably want to use the same naming conventions that you would use with a variable. And then the values can be any data type. In this case, I have a literal string BMW, a literal string 745Li, and a literal number 2010 that represents the year. All right. And notice that the property and the value are separated by the colon character. All right. And then each property definition as well as each function up until the last one are separated by commas. Now I put each of these properties and functions on their own line or series of lines, as it might be for the functions, in order so that we could see some readability, but that's not entirely necessary from JavaScript's perspective. It would be fine if we put all this on one line of code. All right. So again, with regards to the names of both properties and these functions, which I call methods, you'll want to use the same naming conventions that we used previously when we talked about variables. Now there's some other ways to create objects, and I'll discuss another technique in one of the upcoming lessons. So we'll come back to that notion because it'll lead into another discussion that kind of takes us off at a whole other tangent that I don't want to go on right now. So here we define the function, kind of the same notion. I gave it an identifier, the name of the function that I want to access, and then I'm using a function expression and define the function expression within several lines here, but essentially we're just returning a value, or in the case of the second one, just calling console.log. But we could write any number of lines of code inside of here. These are just happen to be very simple for the purpose of illustration. All right, so I've defined my object. Now I want to actually use it and reference it. How do I do that? Well, you can see that whenever I wanted to access a specific property of my object, or when I wanted to access a function, I use the variable name that I set the object reference to, and then I use the period on the keyboard, which I call the property access operator, just the dot on the keyboard. Same is true when accessing a function. As you can see here in line number 15, I use that period, that member access operator. And then, all else is fair. This is a function, so I'm going to use the method invocation operator, just like I would to invoke a normal function. Now, I keep referring to these functions that are inside of an object as a method, and I think you should probably start referring to functions defined inside of objects as methods. It's a more descriptive term, and I'm already used to it from my work with other programming languages, but simply put, a method is a function that belongs to, or rather is defined inside of, an object. Now, there's another syntax that I could use in addition to what you see here, and it opens up some interesting possibilities that, frankly, I'm not very fond of. But you could definitely do something like this. So it almost looks like I'm using the array element accessor to access a specific property here. Let me go ahead and save that. So we'll see the year appear twice here if all goes well, and we do at the bottom. So that's one approach to accessing an individual property. And the other is similar, but it uses an index. So it's actually kind of interesting how this works. What is the index 1 of my car? Let's find out the hard way here. And it's set to undefined in this case. So actually it doesn't reference any of these. It basically creates its own new property and sets its value to undefined. Let's never do that. Let's not do that. I prefer the dot syntax. Again, it's going to be most familiar to those of us coming from other programming languages. But you could, in some advanced scenarios, use these techniques to do something a little more advanced, and that's way beyond the scope of this lesson. All right, so I'd recommend you just use that dot notation for now, and all will be happy. So you can do, like I kind of mentioned a second ago, some pretty advanced things with objects, and there's a lot of room for variation. So I'd recommend taking a look and taking notice of how other people work with objects in their JavaScript code as you're perusing the internet, because there's always seems to be a new twist. I think I understand how objects work, and then I'll see somebody do something really extreme and interesting, and I'm like, wow, that opens up my understanding a little bit more to how objects work. I'll just give you a quick example of what I'm talking about here. Here we can create another car, and I can create an empty object like so. And then I don't have any properties inside of my another car. How do I reference another properties of inside of that? Well, what I can do is just kind of just say, hey, I want to create a property here called whatever. And I'll set it equal to Bob. All right, and it'll just automatically create a property called whatever and set its value equal to Bob, just like that. No let or var keyword or anything. If I do console.log, you'll see that car.whatever, in fact, will come out to be Bob. Or I thought it would. Oh, I think what I'm going to need to do is save my work here and then try this again. Whoops. Oh, I'm sorry. Another car. I had the wrong reference. It didn't exist on car, but we need to look at another car dot whatever. And there we go. There's Bob. Okay. So just an interesting feature of objects. You can add properties kind of ad hoc, and some people do that, and that is kind of a feature, not really a bug of JavaScript. It's dynamically typed. You can just say, hey, I need a property here, I need a function here, and you attach it to an existing object, and there it is. You've got an object now with this additional property called whatever. All right. You can also do some other kind of interesting things. Might as well take a few moments and look at these. So I'm feeling unoriginal now. So I'm going to create a new object called A, and inside of this I'm going to create my property, and I'm going to actually set that to another object. I'll define a property inside of that, and I'll just say hi, because again, I'm feeling rather unoriginal. And so let's figure out how can we actually print out the A. So console.log a.myProperty.b. Will I get what I think I'll get? I will. So you can see how I can chain things together, whether they be functions or properties, by just continuing to use, this is an object that has a property that has an object that has a property. And so I can kind of chain through and create essentially what becomes a namespace. And we'll reference that a little bit later when we talk about solving the global namespace issue, or putting our variables at the global level of our applications, which we're trying to avoid. All right. Let's take a look at another quick, cool example of things you can do with objects that might not be so obvious at first glance. So here I'll create var_c, and inside of that I'm going to create another myProperty. And this time I want to create an array. So this property, the value of my property now will be an array of, I could do strings, I could do numbers, but I could do an array of objects. So all right, and that's perfectly valid. So here, think with me again. I have an object that has a property that contains an array of objects that each have different properties. All right, and that's perfectly valid. So objects can contain properties of the type array that can contain other objects that can contain, well, really just whatever makes sense for your application, however you need to store it and kind of represent the data that you're working with. Also, if you're going to work with an array of objects, it might make sense for all of them to have the same set of properties. Like in this case, each object has a different property. I'm not so sure that would be so useful, but it might be something that you need to model in your application. There's nothing forcing you to keep the same set of properties for any given object inside of an array of that object. You know, as long as your JavaScript code or whatever will consume this object understands how to interpret it, that's all that matters. So once you get past a simple hierarchy of values, you typically refer to something like this that gets a little more complicated as an object graph, a graph of objects. All right, just keep that in mind. Let me paste in some more interesting examples here. Just kind of expand your thought process on how to work with objects. Let's say I have a car lot and I want to store an array of objects. Each object has year, make, and model. All right. Then I could iterate through the car lot and print to screen each of those individual car objects, right? So that's one example. How about, you know, if this was more of a I guess you could say, a system that kept track of all of our customers and employees, we might do something like this. This gets a little more complicated and unfortunately runs off the side of the screen a little bit. But you can see here I'm creating a contacts object. Here's the start and the end. And inside of that I have a property called customers and a property called employees. Now both of these have, as you can see, an array of objects. And these objects look very similar in so much that they have a first name, last name, and then phone numbers. And then phone numbers actually is an array of strings. In this case, this particular, what is he, a customer? This customer, Bob Tabor, has 2 phone numbers. Richard Boughton has 2 phone numbers. And then, but our employees like Steve and Conrad and Grant, well, Steve has 2 phone numbers, but Conrad and Grant only have 1 phone number. All right, so you can see that things can get pretty crazy really quick. But that's a perfectly valid object initializer. It just happens to be a little bit more complex than the ones that we started off with. So now as you're looking at this, you might think to yourself, wow, this actually looks similar. Where have I seen this before? It looks a lot like JSON. Have you heard of JSON, J-S-O-N, or JSON? I guess some people put the emphasis on the on. It's short for JavaScript Object Notation. JSON is both descriptive and compact, and it's probably the most popular way to send information between 2 disparate systems. So we might, in fact, use it to store settings or properties inside of a more advanced JavaScript application, or they use it in Visual Studio and C# projects to store application settings, for example, now in the new version of C# and .NET. We might use it in our application sooner than later to send data between a single page application that lives on the client and the backing web API that on a web server that hosts a web API. If none of that made sense, don't worry about it. Eventually you'll get to that point if you continue on learning JavaScript. All right, so what was my point here? Well, if you're familiar with what JSON is, you might notice that there are a lot of similarities between the object literals that we've looked at in this video and JSON. However, there are some subtle but important differences between the two, and I'm not going to take the time to go through that. You can easily do a quick search online to see what the differences are between object literals in JavaScript and the JavaScript Object Notation, or JSON. Just be aware that these are not one in the same. There are subtle differences. You cannot use them interchangeably, but their syntax is very, very similar. And JavaScript has a built-in function that'll let you work with JSON, as you might expect. Okay. Wow, I've really gone long on this one, but objects are pretty important and we're going to use them a lot. And there's a lot to them. In fact, we're probably going to be talking about them a couple more times before the end of this course, maybe even in the very next video. So you're doing great. Hang in there. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks.